go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Climate Realities Climate Change webinar. As we move into this next decade, the most critical decade for climate change, according to experts, we will be focusing on envisioning our future in relation to the climate. This talk will focus on the dynamics of climate denial, climate migration, and climate war, spoken about respectively by Dr. Laurie Zoloth, Dr. Chris Duran, and Dr. Mark Douglas. Before we head into that discussion, we'll hear a framing by Rabbi Yonatan Nerel, the founding director of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. Rabbi Nerel recently published the book Eco Bible, Volume 1, an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus. And this webinar series is in conjunction with the launch of this book. In just the past 2 months since its release, the Eco Bible has become a #1 bestseller on Amazon in multiple categories. So to start off, Rabbi Nerel will share a short segment of Eco Bible, which is related to today's topic. We'll then hear short talks by each of our panelists and then engage in a dialogue around a few questions related to this topic. Before we close, we'll open it up to participants for questions. So that's you, get your questions ready, add them in the chat anytime you think of them. Please feel free to type those in, and we will definitely come back and get to those questions. So without further ado, let's welcome Rabbi Nerel. Wonderful.
Thank you, Kimiko. It's good to be here with everyone today. Thank you for joining. In synagogues around the world, the weekly Torah portion is going to begin speaking about the story of Joseph. And one of the most powerful stories in the Pentateuch, in the Hebrew Bible, is Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. It sets in motion his rise to power in Egypt and his whole family traveling from Iraq to southwestern Turkey to Syria to Canaan, Israel to Egypt, and then back to Israel. That was in relation to Abraham, but also Joseph travels significantly from Israel to Egypt. In Pharaoh's prophetic dream, 7 robust cows are devoured by 7 frail ones. And the signs seem clear to all who see: 7 good and 7 so bad that they devour the good that was. It's a vision that may foretell of our human endeavors with technology, a golden age of enlightenment and abundance and invention, industrialization, and higher material standards of life, now quivering under the unknown threat of today's ecological crisis. The Egyptians, necromancers, were not able to understand the dream. Was it myopia? Was it denial? But Joseph understood it. Joseph had a vision of what was to come. Now, Joseph is known for his foresight, his vision, anticipating an impending human ecological disaster. He instructed Egypt to make provisions during 7 years of plenty for 7 years of famine that would follow. The rabbi said that Joseph taught the Egyptians to put limits on immediate consumption and ultimately brought them into a caring relationship with the earth. In the book of Proverbs, it's written, "Without vision, the people perish." And that's the situation that we're in today, facing the climate crisis, that we need vision. The rabbis also say, who is wise? The person who sees the long-term effect of their actions. And so long-term thinking and moderating consumption are part of Joseph's legacy. And that, I believe, has something deep to teach us for our times as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Nerel. Yes, thank you for that framing around how the Torah's teachings relate to our current geopolitical challenges. Now, let's turn to our panelists to hear some specifics about how each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll respond to some of the questions together. So once again, if you have any questions that pop up for you, please type them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook, then you can type those in the comments and we'll see those too. So we are going to start with Dr. Zoloth. Dr. Laurie Zoloth is the Margaret E. Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School and the Senior Advisor to the Provost Programs on Social Ethics. A leader in the fields of bioethics and Jewish studies, Dr. Zoloth's forthcoming book, called In Ethics for the Coming Storm, looks at global warming and Jewish moral philosophy. Dr. Zoloth, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here on this panel. A pleasure to think of Torah on Erev Hanukkah, a time of rededication, of course, and a time in which we read the troubling story of Joseph and his struggle with scarcity, his struggle with hunger, and the tragic capacity that he has to foretell the future and yet not be able to control it, not really be able to control it because the future spins out of his control because his great idea ends up in enslaving everyone. So interesting, complicated story. I want to say that I'm a Californian and it's sort of in exile myself in Chicago, where it's a very disturbing 50 degrees today, extremely unusual for Chicago in the middle of December. And today, in today's paper, I read, the New York Times, I read about a beautiful account of the destruction of 3 forests in California because of the horrible fires, of course, driven by climate change. And the one that was most poignant for me was the Joshua Tree, big sequoias, and the redwoods of Big Basin. And the California redwood forest, as a Californian, is an extraordinarily special space. I grew up hiking in those forests. I grew up teaching my children how to camp in those forests. And the thought that that forest is gone and gone forever places me in the same existential position that I'm going to argue we're all in, but makes it clear that we are in exile from the kind of world that was a rather stable climactic world for generation on generation for the 2,000 years that it took to grow those forests in California, and gone in an instant because of our complete inability to control essentially our hungers and our desires. And I want to think about that because my view of the future is a future in which we become capable of radical sacrifice. And if the texts of Torah teach us anything, it teaches us that sacrifice and limits on desires is an essential part of being human. You can't give the corners of your field to the poor unless your fields have limits and corners, unless your fields don't overtake everything. The essential nature of our relationship between self and other is that we have to take care to withdraw our own desires so that we don't overcome the needs and the cries of the others who confront us in a face-to-face relationship, as all relationships ought to be. Climate change presents a very particular problem because it presents a problem that is at once ontological, a large metaphysical problem about how we live in the world, and at once very practical. What do we do about people we live in advanced capitalism? We live in a time when modernity seems not quite in our control. We live in a time of extraordinary political anger and a rejection of what we used to be able to think of as a scientific consensus. Our country rejects not only the climate change, disturbingly enough. The denial is not only for climate change, but the denial is really for science itself. And somehow that's a surrogate for denial of a way of living in the world around in the modern era. And we see this across the board. We see this in the faintly pagan embrace of naturalness, of purity and naturalness, which has long troubled scholars of Jewish thought and the rabbis of the Talmud. This embrace of the natural as sacred in a way that's uncritical or sometimes hostile even to agricultural or organizational forms. We see this in the yearning to go backward into an earlier period in American history, a time when we were able not to think about the challenges of race and gender that we have to confront now. We see this denial of all sorts of elites, not just scientific elites, but a distancing oneself from universities, from fine arts, from museums. This notion of that pulling away leads to a more authentic place is a troubling feature of climate change denial. But the climate change denial that I want to focus on today isn't the denial of other people. Isn't this a denial of people who are out there in the world having an illiberal view of things. It's the denial of our very own friends and our very own supporters and our very own movements. And in this, I want to talk about the way that we have not taken climate change really seriously. And I know we talk about it, and I know we think about it, and I know we used to bring cloth bags to the supermarket, but in some fundamental way, we haven't really faced the existential terror of climate change. Because if we really had, we would live really differently. No one would have a car. We would figure out how to live without cars. No one would be jetting off to academic conferences or climate change conferences, for goodness sakes. No one would be ever eating meat. It would just be a thing that no one would do. In the same way that most people don't smoke anymore because it became sort of a disgusting thing to do, the eating of meat, the embrace of the radical sacrifice that climate change is really going to require of us would simply be easily done. And I know that this denial is widespread within our own community for two reasons. One is because of all the things that I did when I was in academic leadership, administrative leadership at my universities. The most controversial thing I did was to insist that we be vegetarians when we ate communally. And that was so upsetting to people that you could see that it touched something very deep. One scholar of religion came up to me and said, meat is my religion. I need meat, right? People talked about all sorts of health claims around needing meat for their health. It was really quite interesting to me that people were not able to give up meat. Even enlightened people who had understood science, who were deeply involved in climate change activities and in progressive causes, felt somehow that they needed to have meat. It was impossible to think of a world in which meat would not be eaten, not be consumed. The second reason I know this is really important is because 6 years ago, I suggested that our major academic conference, the American Academy of Religion, not be held, that we have a sabbatical year every 7 years. And in that 7th year, we would take stock of who we were, and we would give our papers and our research first to the people within our own communities. And I was thinking not only of my colleagues and my students, but also the people who clean the university, the people who manage the university, the people that staff the university, the people who did the secretarial work of the university, that somehow we'd create a local community, a face-to-face local community in which one didn't need to be jetting about to conferences. And that was, while theoretically embraced, practically no one wanted to do it, because why? No one wanted to give up the extraordinary fun of being at a conference. I want to end by saying one of the ways we know we have to really give some thought to this is because people anticipate the end of the pandemic, of the dreadful, terrible terror that has seized our country in particular. And how people talk about it is to yearn for the resumption of a kind of activity that actually should be impermissible if we think carefully about climate change. A kind of activity that involves lots of air travel, for instance, lots of travel to exotic places, lots of consumptive habits in restaurants, things that we might really think about before we re-embrace. So when people talk about climate change denial, typically they have somebody else in mind. They have some other community in mind. And often it's a community that's poorer, it's less educated, it's religiously different from one's own community. And I'm asking you, in thinking about climate change denial, this very brief introduction, to instead turn that spotlight on one's own practice and begin to think about ways that we politely allow the world to continue, a world that we know is out of control, is broken, unsatisfied, and is yet unredeemed. Hebrew scriptures is a story of exile. Not only are we exiled, of course, dramatically from the Garden of Eden and thrust into a world where we have to work, we have to do agricultural work, hard agricultural work, but we're in exile from the land and we never go back. The Torah ends, 5 books of Moses ends with the Jews on the outside. There's not the account of what happens later, of what state power means. All of that happens outside of the context of the Torah. It happens in the writings, it happens in the prophets, but the Torah itself is a story of never being able to go home, never really quite getting there. And that's why we need an ethics of exilic work, to understand that our situation is very akin to that. We can't really go back. to that world, to the lost world of the big basin redwoods, and so much more we're going to lose. What we can do is live in this exile with decency and with justice. That's my 5 minutes. So I yield the floor to one of my colleagues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Zoloth. That definitely food for thought. If you've got any questions or comments, please put those in because we'd love to hear some more from you. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Duran. Dr. Chris Duran is professor of religion at Pepperdine University and founder and core faculty of the Sustainability Minor, the largest multidisciplinary program in the history of Pepperdine's Seaver College. His current research project seeks to articulate a Christian theological response to both human and non-human migration and displacement due to the climate crisis. Dr. Duran?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation and the ability to participate through this Zoom platform with my colleagues. In 2005, many thought Norman Myers was hyperbolic when he said that it was likely that 200 million humans would be displaced by the consequences of climate change by 2050. If Myers is anywhere near correct, that would mean roughly 1 in every 39 persons on the planet would be displaced by climate change. In 2017, Charles Geiser and his team suggested that that number was wildly incorrect, instead arguing that the number of displaced persons due to the consequences of climate change would be likely closer to 2 billion by the end of the century. Imagine that. Approximately 25% of the world's population likely internally or externally displaced due to the consequences of anthropogenic climate change, and yet virtually no one in the American church is discussing it. For example, currently Pacific Islanders, like the citizens of Tuvalu, seek refuge in New Zealand. The citizens of Kiribati seek higher ground in Fiji. In what is often referred to as the dry corridor of Central America, citizens of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua are leaving their homelands because the droughts have become more frequent and severe, preventing subsistence farmers from being able to sustain their families from one season to the next. On the African continent, the deserts near the equator continue to expand, which causes citizens of numerous nations to search for food and water by moving further north and maybe eventually attempting the treacherous trip to Europe or further south. In the US, the citizens of Alaska, Florida, and Louisiana debate whether they are the first American climate migrants or climate refugees due to rising sea levels. Meanwhile, in my native California, the 2020 wildfire season once again began earlier in the year. This fire season is not yet over, and already millions of acres of land have been burned and dozens of Californians have lost their lives. For the first time, Californians are wondering whether they should move now before things get even worse. So whether that number is 200 million or 2 billion, human civilization, as we have come to know it at least, has never seen migration at either end of that spectrum. While there are still American Protestants who deny that anthropogenic climate change is an existential threat, research shows more younger Protestants believe that it is in fact something to deal with seriously and immediately. And that gives me some sense of hope. Heretofore, though, there has been almost no Christian analysis of climate migration and why it should be a significant priority for Protestant churches in America, especially since few think that their sacred texts can be used constructively to address the challenges brought about by climate change. It's almost as if we believe we have arrived rather than seeing ourselves as migrants, which is so theologically significant to the Judeo-Christian story. In my new project, Climate Exodus, Migration in the Age of Climate Change, I reflect on the stories of Samson, the widow of Zarephath, Ruth, the Apostle Thomas, and Noah, among others, to demonstrate to the American Protestant audience that there is much to learn from appropriate biblical exegesis and theological application today. For example, privileged American Christians are the foremost and forewarned generation of humans to deal with climate change, but instead we live in a state of denial about what is right in front of us, much like the wise and powerful Samson once did with Delilah. Or like the widow of Zarephath, what sorts of social and theological constraints to hospitality Are we willing to re-examine if we are to show radical hospitality to climate migrants? Or while many American Protestants valorize Ruth for binding herself to Naomi, we fail to ask whether that same level of inconvenient sacrifice she exhibits, to the point of putting all of her own desires on hold to serve her mother-in-law, is necessary for demonstrating the Christian love that we all profess. Or while the doubting Thomist often has been ridiculed by Protestants for having too little faith, do we forget that he actually came to accept the identity of the risen Jesus? And could that be a critical lesson for current climate-denying American Christians today? Or finally, like Noah, might American Protestants be willing to accept that behavior modification is more critical than technological development if we are to obey God's calling? To me, these figures demonstrate virtuous examples of at least courage, hope, hospitality, justice, and solidarity. And I believe these things provide novel pathways for how American Protestants might understand climate migration and the treatment of climate migrants today and into the numbers of into the very future decades, into the 21st and the 22nd century. I will stop now and yield back to the MC.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Duran. So lastly, we are going to turn to Dr. Mark Douglas. Dr. Douglas is a professor of Christian ethics and director of the Master of Divinity program at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church and a widely published author on the topic of Christian pacifism. His current work explores connections between violence and climate change at the beginning of the Anthropocene. Dr. Douglas?
Well, thank you, Kamiko. First of all, let me say how honored I am to actually be in a conversation with Laurie and Chris, whose work I admire, and how delighted I am to be able to be a part of this work that Rabbi Nerel and others are doing in the creation of the Eco-Bible. It's just been a splendid time for me. As Kamiko names, I work at the intersection of climate change and violence, and I need to note at the beginning there are actually a lot of intersections. It's not just one. I think of Rob Nixon's work, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where Rob talks about the various ways that climate change is making the lives of especially those in the majority world more difficult. I focus more specifically at the intersection of climate change and war and religion. So those three pieces coming together, which means that I'm dealing with multiple wicked problems at the same time. Wicked problem has been defined as a problem that does not admit to clear solution, either because there is too much ambiguity in the system, or because we don't have enough information about the system, or because an attempt to solve it one way will exacerbate problems on the other side. And war and climate change exhibit both of those aspects of wicked problems. I particularly have been focused on thinking about the relationship between war and climate change from a Christian religious perspective. And toward that end, what I've wanted to suggest is that climate change is reshaping the way we think about the causes of war, the types of war, the participants in war, the exacerbators of war, and even the understandings of war we face as we enter further into the Anthropocene, as we enter further into what we might think of as an environmental age. Toward thinking about how to re-understand these things, I'm beginning by going back and retracing, telling stories and re-narrating the histories of Christian pacifism, of Christian just war thinking, to do a couple of things. The first thing I'm trying to do is reveal the complexities of those narratives, recognizing that the modern narratives of pacifism, of just war thinking, and really of just peacemaking are bound up in and limited by modern assumptions that are themselves problematic. So, for instance, with my first book on Christian pacifism for environmental age, I'm attempting to re-narrate the history of Christian pacifism to introduce much more significantly moral ambiguity into that system, partly because of the moral ambiguity we face as we deal with climate-shaped conflicts, as we deal with war in a warming world. What would it mean that a Christian pacifist who eats meat may be as culpable for conflict as a just warrior who is a vegetarian, for instance? The other piece of that book is an attempt to recognize that the human and non-human natural world have always interacted and shaped these traditions of thought in ways that sometimes do not get recognized. So, for instance, part of the deep history of Christian pacifism is its resurgence in the peace churches at the beginning of the Reformation, early in the Reformation. And one expression of the movement of those peace churches was that often because of threats of violence, they moved from one place to another. However, they were also moving from one place to another because of changing climatic conditions that they were living in as Europe entered into the Little Ice Age. And they were going to particular places as a result of this. One great illustration there is that King Charles of England was in the middle of some fairly active war, or attempting to stir up some war. That was taking his resources, his economic resources, and so he went to a wealthy member of the society, William Penn Sr., and got a loan. Over time, that loan came due. And when that loan came due, the king went to William Penn Jr. Then and said, I don't have money, but I do have this new land over in the New World. And why don't you take it? And so with that, William Penn Jr. brought the Quakers to the United States and established one of the earliest pacifist communities in North America. So that book Christian Pacifism book re-narrates the history of Christian pacifism. I'm doing a similar thing, thinking about the Christian just war tradition, looking specifically at the way that as the Christian just war tradition transitioned from its late medieval to its early modern form, it not only shaped modernity, but shaped modernity's blindnesses to dealing with climate-shaped conflicts. At the end of these things, what I want to suggest is that more than just carry old resources forward, we need to have those resources re-narrated in new histories and new understandings, new narratives about how traditions of religious thought can engage climate-shaped conflicts. I want to think then, for instance, about how reshaping our relationship to the non-human natural world may have implications for, say, just war criteria. If just war criteria is an attempt to limit damage done to peoples, especially to non-combatants, do Christian just warriors have the same responsibility to protect glaciers that they do to protecting non-combatants? Because those non-combatants will likely get into situations where violence is likely as glaciers recede and access to water recedes with it, and competition for water grows. So thinking about re-narrating or kind of revising our relationship to the non-human natural world, thinking about assumptions of resources of the non-human natural world, not only as resource, but as property, something that kind of comes about through just war thinking at that transition period, and recognizing that assumptions about property, especially if they've been developed in modern and late modern capitalism, are exacerbating features here. Thinking about migration. I'm so delighted for the work that Chris is doing with regard to migration, because as he notes, as we enter into a time when hundreds of millions of people are going to be moving, violence is likely to be the implication for that. So that's a little bit of my work. I deal with the really unhappy stuff and don't have a lot of good news for you. Things look like they're going to get worse. With that, I'll wrap up and turn it to people who may have more hopeful visions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Douglas. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that religion can provide hope, and in fact, that's, I believe, part of the importance of bringing religious communities on board to address the ecological crisis is a message of hope. Just a quote from Rabbi Sachs, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. He said, hope is a human virtue, but one with religious underpinnings. At its ultimate, it is the belief that God is mindful of our aspirations with us in our fumbling efforts, that God has given us the means to save us from ourselves, that we are not wrong to dream, wish, and work for a better world. Hope is the knowledge that we can choose, that we can learn from our mistakes and act differently next time. And I believe that's part of the challenge that we're facing today. I want to ask the panelists a question. Many religious people believe that religion is one thing and ecology is another thing. And especially in regards to climate science, many people who can identify as faith adherents are skeptical or deny climate science. Yet Pope Francis speaks about ecological conversion, of essentially converting to an ecological lifestyle of where we're living in balance with God's creation. Can you share your own experience of conversion around climate science? And also, can you share any suggestions you have for communicating articulately to religious people on climate change?
Well, I actually want, in answering that, to reply to Mark Douglas, to say, I don't think climate change is a wicked problem, and I think our text tells us that. I don't think it's a wicked problem at all. I think it's a very straightforward problem. I think it's a problem of sin, and our horrible inability to name it, and to call it out. People have made billions of dollars sucking oil out of the earth and selling it. That's the bottom line. That's a major driver here, right? And we are unable to say that and confront it seriously. And the Torah prelude for this is, of course, Amalek. Amalek creates doubt, right, and sells doubt, and we are obligated to destroy Amalek's memory and to wipe out that doubt-causing capacity, because it's the doubt, it's that we're unable to do it, that it's too wicked for us, it's too complicated for us, we can't possibly address it, it's too big, makes us stop. When in fact, the climate change action begins with naming real enemies, saying that the companies who are making a profit off the climate change have to be stopped, and you have to build a mass political movement to stop it. And that's the kind of war that I'm interested in. That war against sinfulness, that war against evil, that is frankly characteristic of a non-Pacific Jewish tradition. And that it's very hard for us to do that. It's easier for me to I don't have a car. To do that kind of work, and not the harder work of confronting sin and naming it as sin. Right? And even the participation in sin, every time that we do eat meat, every time that we do act as if we don't care about climate change, we participate in the sin of the evil actors. And even as I say that, I realize that it sounds grandiose. And so but I think we have to take that on, right? Because the largely men who are making enormous profits and have built a life around global capitalism have largely built it around energy, the energy production companies, extraction companies. So and they have no intention of stopping. So we have to really understand that and really be able to take it on. How did I become converted to this? I spent many years thinking about ecology, the normal way we thought about ecology, but not about global warming at all, not about how energy drove so much of the disaster, the search for energy drove so much of the collapse. And I read a book. I read a book that was an extraordinary book early on in the debate, but I came late to thinking about climate change as the central moral issue, but it is the central moral issue of our time and our responsibility, and our last hope for changing the world and making it more just really revolves around this. And the COVID pandemic, as terrible as it is just a first act in the unfolding catastrophe. And the same forces that are opposing significant state action, Joseph-like action, to deal with to deal with COVID, those same forces will oppose efforts to do Joseph-like action to deal with climate change. And the book was by Mark Linnaeus, and it's called 6 Degrees, I believe. And it's a compilation of the papers in 2012 or something when he wrote it, of the papers that said what will happen when it's 1 degree warmer, when it's 2 degrees warmer, 3 degrees warmer, 4 degrees warmer. And what's chilling about the book, when I give it to my students to read, hoping for the same conversion, is that every single thing, every measure that he mentioned is happening in the 1 degree chapter has happened. So the book now feels quite prophetic.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, I come from a background where science and faith were often in great tension. And so I studied to be a scientist, and my church community did not support that. So it was a very interesting starting point. And my initial doctoral work was in the intersection of evolution and Christianity and the responses to that. So I come with a lot of scars already, metaphorically speaking, from talking about the intersection of faith and science. And so from that background, there never was really a moment for me where I sort of woke up one day and said, oh, evolution is the correct description of the rise of biological complexity on this planet. It just seemed, after taking a number of classes, that was the best definition, the best theory that explained what we see on this planet. And with those scars kind of in place, the same thing happened with when I started studying climate science, which is there wasn't a moment when I woke up one day and just said, well, the climate change folks must be right. It just sort of is an accumulation of evidence to say, how could this be wrong? And what sort of global conspiracy folks really are like meeting in Aspen somewhere to plan this all out. When you have people from 150 or so nations on the planet that are working on the same problem and come up with the same solution, or the same, at least, diagnosis of the problem, maybe not the same solution, that to me gives me a lot of confidence that we have an idea of what's going on. And so it's now a problem of the will. It's a volitional problem of, do I want to accept reality for what it is? Do I want to see what is in front of me? So that's part of it. Just sort of my scientific background is I just never had a problem with this. And then switching to my theological methodology when I went to grad school, it sort of helped me to understand that this is, I agree with Dr. Zoloth, this is a problem of the human capacity to accept reality, and from a Christian lens to say, do we want to be sinners or do we want to be righteous people? And unfortunately, sin is so pervasive, and so, and in particular, when we think about the harm that we cause each other through our anthropogenic climate change, I think we don't want to even face the reality that the daily things that we do as Americans are really harming people halfway around the world. And how do we sort of come to grips with that? And so denial is a powerful way of not coming to grips with those sorts of things. And then the last quick thing for me that was so important, I think. So I'm a recreational scuba diver, which is, again, not the most climate friendly habit, but it does give me an opportunity to be underwater and see the devastation of climate change, and see coral reefs be eroded away and die off, and some other things happen. And I really was diving off of the Maldives a few years ago and sort of had my Job in the whirlwind moment. I was about 100 feet below the surface, looking at some octopi and realizing there's a lot on this planet that has nothing to do with me, but my ability to impact the rest of the planet is so disproportional to this octopus that was sitting in front of me. And it might seem small, but I think it's a moment where we say, do we become humble like Job and accept our place in the universe? Or do we just sort of rail against that and say, no, I should get to have my way because I'm a Homo sapien? And I think that's something for people of faith really to grapple with. Should we be humble on this planet and accept our place and work within that? Or do we just continue to, throw metaphorical stones at God and say, I want to be in the place of the creator rather than the place of the creature.
For myself, so I grew up on a farm in Colorado and spent a lot of my childhood escaping outdoors and into the mountains, and kind of grew up with a deep love of being outside. Like Chris, as an undergraduate, I was actually a science major, majored in biology with some focus on pre-med, but also on environmental issues. I also grew up in a mainline church, the Presbyterian Church, which has the advantage, if you will, of not having kind of the levels of combatancy between science and religion that you might find in some other Christian communions or other faith traditions. The result of that is I never really felt a great deal of tension between faith and science because my connections were being affirmed throughout. My conversion to attention to climate change probably reveals the degree to which I am Reformed, because Reformed folks, theologians, don't think conversion happens at once, right? We think you're just kind of continually in process of being converted by God. I can point to specific instances where attention to climate change had an impact on shaping me personally and some of my habits, or shaping some of the work that I do professionally. One example certainly would be reading and then watching Al Gore's work in the early 90s, and having him really kind of produce evidence about, or show evidence of, the reality of climate change, even before some of the impacts were especially being developed. Over time, as I've just continued to work at the intersections of religion and science and environmental issues, the impacts have continued to grow more severe. So I'm still being converted. There are still a lot of things that I do that are not good for addressing climate change. And there's some things I don't do that I need to learn to do better. With Laurie, I also want to recognize that individual habits are important, but they're never going to be sufficient to addressing the mandate to bring about radical change in wider societies. Which is probably why I think about climate change as a wicked problem, Laurie, partly because it's sin, and for Reformed theologians, sin is the ultimate wicked problem. But beyond that, once you get into the complexities of political sensibilities and even deep ambiguities, right? What do we do with divisions in the world where people in majority world are seeking development that right now is most likely to come about through access to cheap energy that can be, or for them is often associated with uses of fuels that are harmful and exacerbate climate change. Like, that's part of the wickedness here. We don't want to say, well, let's everybody quit what we're doing and burning fossil fuels and everything else. And by the way, those who didn't have the advantage of the Industrial Revolution, well, you're just hosed by this. That's not to say that we can't be making significant problems and bringing about significant change. It's really, really great that kind of the two fastest growing industries in the developed world are solar panel installation and wind turbine technicians, right? And that's going to move into the majority world too, already is moving in the majority world too. That's all to the good. The trick is just kind of, how do you moderate the significant levels of inequity and inequality along the way?
One thing about this, and it came up in our chat, one of our colleagues in the audience asked the question about, what about this economic dislocation? And I just have to say, if we took it as seriously as abolitionists took slavery, this would be an easy question, not wicked at all. It was really hard to end slavery, right? The vast majority of wealth in the South was tied up in the slave. The slave trade was a massive economic engine, a massive development engine. You could have made the thing about what's going to happen if we change the slave trade and don't have cotton and rum, exchanges to workers in the North. What's going to happen? What will occur to them? And yeah, it was really hard to give that up. And in fact, people in the colonies, other colonies than America, wanted to use slaves because they wanted rapid development. And it's much easier to force people to work and not pay them. So that exact argument was used to defeat people who were arguing for the abolition of slavery. And finally, it just got to be so disgusting to the human spirit, so very wrong in terms of our biblical texts, that it had to stop. It just had to stop, right? Even though Actually, some of our texts endorse it, even though it was an economical disaster for probably the majority of people. But it was, and this is where Immanuel Kant comes in. Utilitarianism fails. And that's why you need to understand that each person is a kingdom of ends, that great leap in moral philosophy made possible by looking at slavery in this way.
Right. I guess the
you have to make that same kind of leap. It will be really, really hard and it will dislocate people. But the answer isn't to keep them from being dislocated. The answer is to figure out a way to address their needs, figure out a solution to address their needs and have it happen rapidly. Because if we don't, everyone will die. It's like, you know, it's not even an interesting outcome. It's like so stark that we should be able to do it. Whereas slavery could have kept on limping along with tremendous, horrible human cost, right? But it wasn't the species ending event, right? But this is in some ways more degrading and more horrible and more unjust than even than slavery. So that's why the economic arguments against it, you know, I think should really be regarded as distracting us from the actual moral harm that's taking place.
And I guess the question for me is what's the appropriate analog to climate change? Is it slavery, or is it the antecedents to slavery, which is assumptions about economic systems and race that have continued long past the end of formal slavery, at least in North America, right? And so just to have that out there. I doubt that Yonatan thought that we would get into a debate between Mark Douglas and Laurie Zoloth on this one along the way. So we can move aside from that. But I do want to say I'm in really radical agreement with Laurie A, that you don't want to swamp people with despair. But along with it, I also want to say that if you suggest to people that the solution is easy if only you do it, and then they find out they can't do it, that's its own cause for despair.
Okay. It's not easy. It's going to be exquisitely difficult because the forces against it are very powerful. So far have won every fight. So it's going to be very difficult.
So I want to ask you a second question in relation to this issue of how do we transition to a clean and just economy away from fossil fuels to renewable energies and energy efficiency and reducing our use of energy. Many religious people don't see ecological sustainability or climate change as a pro-life issue. And many religious people in the United States see pro-life and anti-abortion as a or the central religious issue. What can help move the needle within religious communities to prioritize climate action and to help climate refugees?
Well, I'm starting that work, and I don't have a complete answer, but I have some pathways maybe to consider. And one is to accept that in American Protestant circles in particular, the articulation of anti-abortion efforts and pro-life movements has been articulated in such a way with so many dollars behind it that it is a very narrow pathway to thinking about pro-life issues. And so some others in the evangelical community, for example, Catherine Hayhoe has said to her evangelical folks, climate change is the pro-life issue of the next 300, 400, 500, 600 years. And we've got to stop looking at the abortion issue as some kind of narrow idea of what pro-life is. So I think there is something about thinking about how the 1980s and 90s, the communication strategies created such a narrow pathway, and then figuring out how to open up that pathway. I think the good news is that younger evangelicals and other Protestant Christians see climate change as a bigger issue than older generations of Protestant Christians. So I'm slightly optimistic about that. So there's different ways of opening that dialogue up with younger folks. But the second one that I think is going to be something that we all need to pull together on is rising, nationalism, populism, whatever you want to call it, tribalism that we see across the world is creating, is sort of leaning into this us versus them kind of idea. And we see it on just about every continent on the planet right now. And I think we're going to have to, at least as I work with Christian communities the most, start looking at our texts and saying, where is this us versus them language coming from? Because it's not coming from a Christian place. It's not coming from the traditional texts of either the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible. And we're going to have a real reckoning with the kind of nationalism that has been accepted by so many American Protestants, that we can help people here, but not there. We can help people over there, but not over in this direction. And I think what climate change is forcing us to think about very seriously is the us versus them tribalism never was morally acceptable, but it really is going to have dramatic impacts when we see climate migrants and climate refugees moving around the planet in ways that we've never seen in human history. And we're going to see death and violence in the way that we've never seen. And we're going to be able to see it live almost because of our ability with communication technology to see things in real time. And I think that's something for us to consider, is like, if particularly for Protestants who say helping human beings is all that's important, and we'll put the ecological stuff to the side, that's a false dichotomy. But we can look at climate migration as the ultimate help your neighbor issue. And we've got to reframe it in that way. And if the climate change stuff comes along with it, great. But at this point, I don't think we can burn any bridges. We're going to have to mobilize every practical avenue. And, you know, loving your neighbor as yourself in both the Jewish and the Christian tradition is a helpful way, I think, to start to think about climate migration from a pro-life position.
I think
there's rich resources in our traditions, and by the way, and in the Quran and the Upanishads and the Vedas as well, about the meaning of the stranger and the challenge presented by a stranger coming into your community, and what your obligations are to the stranger, and why. I mean, of course, that's part of the Exodus story. You know, I was a stranger in a strange land. And that notion of estrangement, essential estrangement from society, and the re-embrace by God and by God's people is really a key part of the story. The pro-life debate is very, we could talk all day about this, but it's very interesting to see. If you want to think optimistically about religion, you can say, well, look how a debate about faith enters into the public arena, and gets powerful. Could anything else be as beautifully powerful? We like the power, but we don't like the consequence of the debate. And part of that has to be, from a Jewish perspective, is because that's just not a part of the Jewish tradition, right? The hysterical opposition to abortion is a very unnuanced position, because within Jewish texts, certain abortions are permitted, right? So it's left views out of the debate, and it gives you a hint, I think, that much of the passion behind anti-abortion is about controlling women, because it emerges just at the moment that women not only want to control the reproductive capacity, they want to enter into society in a very, very different way in 1973. And that shift about what kind of power that women would have, and the extraordinary force of that movement is not disconnected. And so much of what it looks like a reproductive debate about reproduction, about babies, is clearly not, because WIC funding constantly is cut by the same people who say they're pro-life, because maternal mortality, especially in the African American community in America, is rising at really tragic rates. So if we really cared about pregnant women and babies, we would have very different healthcare policies. And that we've never been able to make even that connection. So drawing it backward to the connection we want to make via the abortion debate, I think will prove to be extraordinarily difficult. But I do think we have resources to think about strangers and what we owe to strangers as persons of faith. And I think that might be a richer source and a more sustainable source of discourse for us. One that we can agree on, rather than continuing the absolute ongoing and semiotic fight around abortion, because it's a symbol of many other things. Really, we're not talking about life, pro or anti-life in that debate anymore.
And I think I would just add quickly one qualification and then one suggestion. The qualification is that at least within American Christianity, the mainline Protestant traditions, by and large, have affirmed women's right to choose. The members of those denominations don't necessarily agree with abortion or not, but they're not kind of explicitly pro-life in the same way. The second thing I would suggest, at least, is to say, for me, a lot of the anti-abortion movement involves three refusals. The first refusal is the refusal of dealing with complexity, ambiguity, and tragedy. The second refusal is the refusal to recognize that who our neighbors are, we don't get to determine, and that everybody can count as a neighbor. And the third refusal is to actually pay attention to our texts. The biblical text says almost nothing explicitly about abortion, but it talks about a lot of other stuff about neighbor love along the way. I suspect that those three refusals are manifesting in the climate debates as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas and Dr. Zoloth and Dr. Duran, for an energizing and enlightening conversation. As you just mentioned, Dr. Douglas, there's a deep teachings in the Bible about a lot of things, including ecological sustainability. So this is a plug for Eco Bible, which is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and iBooks and other bookstores. This webinar is shareable on Facebook. It's already been on Facebook Live. So if you liked it here on Zoom, then please share it with others. And I turn it back to Kimiko for a final word about our upcoming webinars. Or I'll make that final word. The webinars are going to be happening on a monthly basis. We held one last month on food, faith, and gratitude right before Thanksgiving, and we're going to be holding them in 2021 on a monthly basis, featuring leading scholars on religion and ecology in conversation about how do we ensure the next generation can inherit a livable planet. Thank you so much for joining today. Have a great day.
Thanks for having us.